Okay, so I'd just like to make a preemptive apology for my attempts at pronouncing ancient Celtic and Latin terms. See how I do. Hopefully I do all right with them. So in this talk, I will be exploring the myth of King Arthur. This story is a powerful primordial narrative, and it's a tale of the British Isles. I will start my talk with a brief history of the British Isles. I will then focus on the origins of the myth of King Arthur and how this story developed and changed over hundreds of years. After this, and for the bulk of my presentation, I will focus on the 1981 film Excalibur, which I believe creates a powerful fusion of all the major mythological themes that were developed in the older Arthurian tales. I think the best place to start this discussion is with a brief history of the British Isles. The UK was occupied by various hominid species throughout its history, but the first evidence of modern humans creating a sedentary civilization here occurred 11,000 years ago, when bands of settlers from Europe migrated to the country. The last ice age to occur was known as the Younger Dryas, and it made the UK uninhabitable for humans. The land was clear of all people at the end of this period, which occurred around 14,000 years ago. At this point, the Holocene, a period of global warming, began. The Holocene has continued to the present day. At the start of this period, the UK became an attractive prospect for European settlers. They traversed the land bridge that connected the UK to continental Europe, which was known as Doggerland, and they settled here. Between 9000 and 4000 BC, farming and tool-making techniques improved. By 4300 BC, the British people had fully embraced the agricultural revolution. They became sedentary. They engaged in mass deforestation of the landscape to make room for farmland. They also started constructing a wide variety of monuments across the countryside, such as chambered tombs and stone circles. They created many pieces of art. However, they didn't develop a writing system, so no myths nor any other written documents were left behind by these people. Celtic culture originated in Central Europe in the region of Hallstatt in Austria between 800 and 450 BC. This culture quickly expanded across the rest of Europe by transcultural diffusion and the migration of Celtic people. This expansion occurred primarily after 450 BC. Transcultural diffusion is the spread of cultural items such as ideas, styles, religions, technologies, and languages between individuals, whether within a single culture or from one culture to another. By the 1st century BC, the UK had fully become a Celtic society. British people adopted the various Celtic verbal and written languages, and Celtic art, architecture, technology, and religious symbolism spread across the land. The Roman conquest of the UK then began in 43 AD. The Roman Empire was the great civilization of its day. In its heyday, it stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In the British Isles, the Romans conquered Wales and most of England. A wall was built across the north of England, known as Hadrian's Wall. In this period, many people who were part of the Roman Empire moved to Britain. Although the native Britons, south of the wall, mostly kept their land, they were subject to the Roman governors, whilst those north of the wall and those who lived in modern-day Ireland remained fully independent and unconquered. The Roman Empire retained control of this region until its departure in 410 AD. At this point, the Roman Empire fell. Between 400 and 500 AD, three major Celtic cultures existed in the UK. In England and Wales lived the Britons, a people who embraced a mixture of Celtic and Roman culture. In the north lived the Pickforth people, and in Ireland and Western Scotland lived the Gaelic people. The Britons, Picts and Gaels are now all recognised as individual Celtic cultures, each with their own language and traditions, technology, artwork and mythology. Shortly after the Romans left the UK, the Saxons started migrating here. In fact, 3 different groups of people started migrating to the UK during this period: the Angles and the Saxons from North Germany, and the Jutes, who came from Denmark. The English historian Bede, who lived between 672 to 735 AD, asserts the Anglo-Saxon migration to the UK occurred in 3 phases: an exploration phase, when mercenaries came to protect the resident population, a migration phase, and an establishment phase, in which the Anglo-Saxons started to dominate and to control areas. During the Roman occupation, most inhabitants of England and Wales spoke Breton, a Celtic language, and also in many cases Latin. However, by the 8th century, the dominant language in the East and Southern England was Old English, which was massively influenced by the Anglo-Saxon languages. The story of King Arthur originally developed from the conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic Britons. According to medieval histories and romances, King Arthur was a legendary British leader who led the defense of the nation against the Saxon invaders in the late 5th and early 6th century. The details of Arthur's story appear in folklore and literary tales during this period. The major early sources that feature the story of King Arthur include the Annales Cambri, written in the 10th century, the Historia Britonum, written in 828 by the monk Nennius, the text De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written in 540 AD by the monk Gildas, and the poem Eager Dodin, written shortly after 600 AD by the Celtic bard Aneurin. In the first of these texts, Arthur is a great warrior. In the later stories, he becomes a king. In some of these tales, he is a Christian. In others, he is a Celt. Initially, he represents the spirit of the Britons fighting against the Saxon invaders. In later stories, he develops into a great king and warrior who defends the land from human and supernatural enemies. He also becomes a magical figure of folklore, sometimes associated with the Welsh otherworld and Wynn. The text that helped develop King Arthur as a figure of international interest was Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful and imaginative 12th century tome, Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey depicted Arthur as the British king who defeated the Saxons and established a vast empire. Many elements and incidents that are now an integral part of the Arthurian mythology appear in this text, including Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, the magician Merlin, his wife Guinevere, the sword Excalibur, Arthur's conception at the castle Tintagel, his battle against Mordred at Camlan, and his final rest in Avalon. The 12th century French writer Chrétien de Troyes, who added Lancelot and the Holy Grail to the story, began the genre of Arthurian romance that became a significant strand of medieval literature. In these French stories, the narrative focus often shifts from King Arthur to other characters, such as the various knights of the Round Table. Thomas Malory wrote his grand text, Le Morte d'Arthur, around 1470 AD. It was originally titled The Whole Book of King Arthur and His Noble Knights of the Round Table, but it was later changed to Le Morte d'Arthur by William Caxton, who first published the text in 1485. There is speculation about the identity of Thomas Malory. The most likely candidate is Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel in Warwickshire. His story is absolutely fascinating. I'm not going to discuss it in any depth in this presentation, but it's an unbelievable tale, and I would recommend people look into it. I'll give you a little taster now. He was knighted in 1441 and served as a soldier. Later, he was elected to Parliament and served as a Knight of the Shire. He fought in the War of the Roses, initially for the side of York and later for the side of Lancaster. He also engaged in a life of crime and spent many of his years in prison. He was a thief, a bandit, a kidnapper, and according to some sources, a rapist. It is believed he wrote Le Morte d'Arthur between 1460 and finished it in 1470. He then died in 1471. Malory compiled stories about King Arthur from both British and French sources, and he put together an epic tale that charts the whole of Arthur's life. He borrowed heavily from the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chrétien de Troyes. Malory's tale comprises of 21 individual books. In these books, we see the birth and early life of Arthur, the establishment of his kingdom, the drawing together of the Knights of the Round Table, Arthur's wars in France against the forces of Rome. There are tales of the various Knights of the Round Table. A number of these focus on Sir Lancelot and Sir Gareth. There is also the story of Sir Tristram and his lover, Isolde. There is the quest to find the Holy Grail. There is the collapse of the Brotherhood of the Round Table and the kingdom, the subsequent war, and Arthur's eventual death. Le Morte d'Arthur is an epic work, and it brings together all of the major themes from the story of King Arthur. It is a long and episodic tale that slowly explores each of these themes. In stark contrast, the 1981 film Excalibur, I believe, creates a powerful fusion of the key elements of Arthurian mythology. The film was directed by British filmmaker John Boorman. The screenplay for it was written by John Boorman and his longtime collaborator, Roscoe Pallenberg. I believe this film is a masterpiece, and it's by far the best movie ever made about King Arthur. I think the film's great masterstroke is that it gets rid of all the surplus elements of the tale, and only the core is left. The vital mythological themes are then fused together, and what emerges is a primordial story of vast power. I will focus on the themes explored in this film for the rest of my presentation. Excalibur starts with the superimposed text, "The Dark Ages, the land was divided and without a king. Out of those lost centuries arose a legend of the sorcerer Merlin, of the coming of a king, of the sword of power, Excalibur." We're then given the story of Uther Pendragon. The sorcerer Merlin recognizes him as the great knight of his day. He gives Uther the sword Excalibur so he can become king and unite the land. Uther forges a pact with the Duke of Cornwall. In their meeting, Uther agrees to give Cornwall more land. In exchange, Cornwall agrees to support Uther as king. However, this pact only lasts a few hours. Uther's men have a feast with Cornwall's men, and Uther instantly begins lusting after Cornwall's wife, Igraine. He screams out that he must have her, and the pact between the two houses falls apart. Cornwall and his troops hole up in their castle, Tintagel, which is built on a headland overlooking a beach. Uther's men lay siege to the castle, and the fight between the two houses proceeds. But Uther is seemingly unconcerned with this. His main priority is sleeping with Igraine. He asks Merlin to use his magic to help him in this endeavor. Merlin says he will help if Uther agrees to give him the produce of his affair with Igraine. Uther agrees to this pact. That night, Uther's men retreat from the castle. Cornwall's men pursue them. Uther stays behind. He meets Merlin at a stone circle on the headland at the other side of the beach to the castle. A thick mist hangs in the air above the beach and leads the way to the castle. Merlin tells Uther that he called upon the power of the dragon and weaved a mist out of the dragon's breath. Uther is able to ride his horse over the mist. He uses his lust to carry him over the clouds and over the walls of Tintagel. He also changes his visage so he appears as Cornwall. He then enters the castle and sleeps with Igraine. At the same time, Uther's forces battle against Cornwall's forces. Cornwall dies in the battle and his forces are defeated. Igraine becomes pregnant with Uther's child. He moves in with her and she gives birth to his son, Arthur. Merlin comes to collect Arthur owing to the pact he made with Uther. Uther hands over his son to Merlin, who takes him away. Uther then chases after Merlin, asking for his boy back. It's at this point that the group of men loyal to the late Duke attack Uther. He's wounded and he struggles on through the forest to a stone. He thrusts the sword Excalibur down into the stone before dying. In the film, the character Uther is portrayed as animalistic, as a slave to his instincts. A few hours after making the alliance that ensures he will become king of Britain, he destroys it by openly lusting after Igraine. In the siege that follows, he uses Merlin's magic to help him sleep with Igraine. He ignores his allegiance to his troops as their general, and it's only by good fortune that his men defeat Cornwall's forces. It's not by Uther's doing. He agrees to give Merlin the produce of his lust with Igraine, but he doesn't consider the ramifications of this pact. All he is concerned about is his lust. In the end, he is hunted down like an animal, and his death at the hands of the late Duke's men is justified because of his evil actions. Uther's reign as king of Britain is extremely short. He is unable to unite the realm because he cannot rise above his base instincts. He is incapable of working productively with those he needs to. He represents Celtic Britain. He is a Celtic warlord. He is fearsome and brave, but he lacks the reason and civility of a Christian king. This is the argument that's presented in the story, at least. Personally, I don't fully agree with this notion, but I think it's important to explore it. In contrast to his father, Arthur is portrayed as a king who is thoughtful, humble, moral, and yet he is also courageous and true. He represents a Christian king and the tougher moral path they must walk if they are to serve God. Arthur receives wise counsel from Merlin and from other people, and he listens. He is able to unite the various warring factions and knights of the land to his cause. He is able to bring the country together. He builds a beautiful castle, Camelot, and within it a round table where the knights come to talk about quests they have completed and the victories they have achieved. Camelot becomes a centre of art and science, and there is peace and prosperity throughout the land. Unlike Uther's short and disaster-strewn reign, Arthur's reign as king is successful for many years, but again, unfortunately, everything falls apart. In the story, the source of Arthur's power is the sword Excalibur. More accurately, Excalibur represents the responsibility that comes with power. Arthur is able to draw the sword from the stone where many other knights have failed because he is destined to rule the land. He is the son of the previous king. When he died, Uther drove the sword into the stone. The only one who can wield it now is his son. In the British aristocracy, before the modern era, when a king died, his firstborn son would take the crown and become the new king. The king then becomes the divine ruler of the land. This is a concept that is frequently mocked in contemporary society. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes the term divine right of kings as a political doctrine in defense of monarchical absolutism, which asserted that kings derived their authority from God and could therefore not be held accountable for their actions by any earthly authority, such as Parliament. The divine right theory can be traced to the medieval conception of God's award of temporal power to the political ruler, paralleling the award of spiritual power to the church. I find this definition quite condescending. Personally, I don't believe in an aristocracy with a king who is God's servant on earth. I don't believe this is the best way to run a complex human society. But I have respect for the traditions we embraced in our history. I think it's vital to accept the good and the bad as all being part of the richness of history. I also don't believe the Encyclopedia Britannica definition does justice to the idea of the divine right of kings. Yes, in this doctrine, the king is the supreme ruler of the land and has been chosen for this task by God, but he is also directly beholden to God. If he succeeds in his reign, he will have God's blessing. If he fails, he will face God's wrath. As a young man, Arthur is able to pull the sword from the stone because he has God's blessing, but he must then struggle constantly during his reign so he can continue to receive God's blessing. Later in the story, as Arthur is trying to establish himself as king, he and his knights are marching across the land when they discover Lancelot, who has blocked a bridge and barred their way. Lancelot says if there is a knight who can beat him in single combat, he will pledge allegiance to that man and to their cause. He defeats all of Arthur's knights, so Arthur decides to fight Lancelot himself. They joust and then engage in a sword fight. At the end of their duel, Lancelot has all but won, but instead of accepting defeat, Arthur calls upon the power of Excalibur, and he slices through Lancelot's spear. Lancelot is beaten, and Excalibur shatters. Arthur gazes at his broken sword. Merlin approaches, and Arthur says to him, "My pride broke it. My rage broke it. This excellent knight who fought with fairness and grace was meant to win. I used Excalibur to change that verdict. I have lost for all time. The ancient sword of my fathers, whose power was meant to unite all men, not to serve the vanity of a single man." Arthur throws his broken sword into a nearby pool of water. Merlin gasps and points to the pool. Arthur turns and sees the Lady of the Lake, holding Excalibur, now reforged. Arthur takes a sword from her. Throughout the story, we see Excalibur is a fearsome weapon when it is used honorably and courageously. However, we see here that when it is used for dishonorable purposes, it breaks easily. This is a metaphor for power. When power is used honorably and responsibly, it can accomplish great deeds. Towns, cities, and kingdoms are built, alliances forged, technologies advanced, and criminals are brought to justice. But when power is used poorly, all of the aforementioned signs of progress are wiped out, and in their place, chaos erupts. In this scene, the Lady in the Lake helps Arthur because he recognizes his folly. As an agent of God, she repairs the sword and gives it back to him. This event shows he has regained God's blessing. I asserted before that Arthur's reign ushers in a period of peace and prosperity in the land. The Knights of the Round Table establish order across the nation. Camelot becomes a center of art and science. The king, the land, and all its subjects are happy. However, eventually, all this falls apart. Throughout this period, Lancelot and Guinevere pine for each other. Lancelot cannot bear to join the other nobility at the Round Table, nor can he bear to stay in Camelot. The brotherhood suffers because he has exiled himself from it. He wounds himself with his sword because of his love for Guinevere. Eventually, Lancelot and Guinevere are unable to hide their love. They run away together into the forest and lie with each other. Arthur finds out what they have done. He pursues them to the forest and finds them naked and entwined. Arthur then thrusts Excalibur down into the earth between them. On waking, the lovers stare aghast at the sword. Lancelot shouts out, "A king without a sword, a land without a king." He then runs off through the trees and he relinquishes his status as a knight. The affair between Lancelot and Guinevere has destroyed the fragile happiness that existed in the kingdom. Arthur's marriage has fallen apart. He has so far produced no heirs, and his best knight has cuckolded him. His response to this is to drive the source of his power as king, the sword Excalibur, down into the earth. He gives up the power he has been given by God to rule the nation. He relinquishes the burden that was placed on his shoulders, and the realm falls into ruin. Like Uther, the sorcerer Merlin also represents ancient Britain. He wears a magician's cloak and he performs various magical rituals from stone circles. Many of the British stone circles that people visit today as tourist sites date back to 5, even 6,000 years ago, to a time before recorded history. Merlin represents a link to this point in the country's history. He also harnesses the power of the dragon of chaos to help Uther, and he discusses the dragon with both Arthur and Morgana. After Arthur has pulled the sword from the stone, he goes with Merlin, who tells him about the dragon. Merlin asks Arthur, "What are you afraid of?" Arthur replies, "I don't know." Merlin then states, "Shall I tell you what's out there? The dragon, a beast of such power that if you were to see it whole and complete in a single glance, it would burn you to cinders. It is everywhere. It is everything. Its scales glisten in the bark of trees. Its roar is heard in the wind, and its forked tongue strikes like lightning." The dragon, a creature of myth and legend, is found in almost every culture in the world in some form. In Celtic mythology, the dragon existed in a world parallel to the physical realm. The Celts believed the dragon's power affected the land, and that the path a dragon took was important to the flow of energy through the physical world. Areas where dragons often passed or where they rested were more powerful than the surrounding areas. The dragon was also a gatekeeper to other worlds and a guardian to the secrets of the universe. Morgana tells Merlin that like him, she has magic power. He replies, "The days of our kind are numbered. The one God comes to drive out the many gods. The spirits of wood and stream grow silent. It's the way of things. Yes, it is a time for men and their ways." We see in this speech that as the UK moved from the Celtic age to the new Christian age, the old gods and the magic that existed in the old Celtic world no longer had a place. The new world was constructed by men who learned the mysteries of the old one. By learning these mysteries, they were able to create the new world with its religion based on one God, its higher level of morality, its scientific enlightenment, and its ever-advancing human-engineered systems. I believe Merlin represents the Celtic history of the UK and also the country's ancient history that came before the Celts. He is able to commune with animals. He performs his magic in stone circles, and he is able to speak the language of the dragon of chaos. At the same time, Arthur discovers Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. Merlin is deceived by Morgana. He knows this will happen, but even so, he walks headlong into his destiny. In a conversation with Arthur prior to this, he says his time on earth is over and he will not see Arthur again. He then takes Morgana into the heart of the castle of Camelot. She says to him, "The charm of making, you swore to pass it to me. They enter a cave beneath the castle. Stalactites hang from the roof, and stalagmites push up from the earth. She asks, "What is this place?" He replies, "Here you enter the coils of the dragon. Here my power was born. Here all things are possible, and all things meet their opposites." She says more, "Show me more. Show me the dragon. Tell me the secret charm of making." He gazes at her with the eyes of the dragon, and she screams. When she recovers, he tells her the charm of making. Anal nadrak, ufbas bethad, dofshel diemha. It's Old Irish, and it translates breath of serpent, spell of life and death, thy omen of making. Morgana learns the spell, and she is able to use it to imprison Merlin in a block of ice. He dies encased in ice under the castle in the coils of the dragon. At a symbolic level, I think this scene is fantastic. Merlin and Morgana enter the cave that exists beneath the castle, and it's called the coils of the dragon. The notion here is that the building blocks of our world exist beneath the surface reality we see. At a scientific level, this is absolutely true. The building blocks of a tree exist in its roots, its leaves, its bark, and the ecosystems that surround it. The building blocks of complex organisms are the microscopic single-cell life forms that combine to make up these larger beings. The building blocks of the universe exist in the study of particle physics and the study of the infinite expanse of space. In Excalibur and other Arthurian stories, all of these realms exist beneath our reality, are portrayed as the coils of the dragon. The dragon is the force that courses through each of these underlying dimensions, and the cave that contains the coils of the dragon is found beneath the castle of Camelot, beneath the grand edifice of civilization. Merlin then shows Morgana the face of the dragon, and she screams. I believe the idea here is that he shows her all of the underlying dimensions that exist beneath our world and across the universe. She sees an infinity of data and a universe that extends far beyond anything she can comprehend, and it terrifies and overwhelms her. When she has recovered, he tells her the charm of making. These are the words that allow you to manipulate the chaos of nature. Unfortunately, Morgana immediately uses this power for evil. She imprisons Merlin in a block of ice and thus kills him. We see this was her intention all along, to learn his power so she could use it for her own advantage and not to help others. Merlin represents a good force that exists in the realm of chaos. He uses the power of the dragon to promote order, to unite the land under one king, and to bring peace and prosperity to the nation. Morgana, however, represents an evil force that exists in the realm of chaos. She uses the power of the dragon to benefit herself at the expense of others and to bring chaos and destruction to the land. After killing Merlin, she comes to Arthur. Having discovered Lancelot and Guinevere's adultery, he has fallen into a deep depression. She comes to him in the form of Guinevere. She uses the charm of making to change her appearance, and they sleep together. Afterwards, she reveals to him her true identity. She tells him she has conceived a son, and she leaves. Morgana plays the same trick on Arthur that Uther played on Igraine. Arthur himself was conceived through deception and adultery, and he was born into chaos. Merlin took him from his father and mother because they were unable to raise him well. Indeed, shortly after Merlin took Arthur away, Uther was murdered. Arthur was then raised by Sir Ector as a foster child, and his identity was kept from him. It was only revealed to him after he pulled the sword from the stone. So Arthur was born into chaos, and he grew up in this state. He didn't have anything that closely resembled a normal childhood. When he pulled the sword from the stone, he inherited a kingdom that his father had destroyed. But he wasn't like his father. He was able to establish order, and as a king, he enjoyed a long and successful reign. I think this highlights an important truth in most people's lives. We are born into a situation where there is some order, but there is also a vast amount of chaos. As we grow into adults, we try to establish order in our lives, and once we have done so, we try to maintain it. If we are moral and are able to delay gratification, then we can keep chaos at bay, but not forever. Eventually, chaos will always come rushing back in. Arthur's character arc in the film is that he is born into chaos, but because he is raised well, he is able to establish order, and he enjoys a successful reign. However, eventually the chaos that surrounded his birth, and that was always a part of him, comes back, and it consumes him. Mordred is born from Arthur's incestuous coupling with his half-sister Morgana. Mordred is the personification of the chaos that exists in Arthur's soul. He is the disease that threatens to destroy the realm, to turn Arthur's reign into one of mayhem, and to condemn the country forever. We all have that spectre within us, the potential to become corrupted, to make a terrible mistake that destroys us, to become addicted to alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, food, to become fat and lazy, to spend more money than we have, and to fall into financial ruin. Disaster is always there. It's always lurking. Mordred represents this lurking disaster. After this point in the story, there is a heavy use of the pathetic fallacy. Following the collapse of the kingdom, we see toil and devastation in the land. There are poor harvests, famine, and pestilence. The people are destitute. At an earlier point, Arthur asks Merlin, "What does it mean to be king?" Merlin replies, "You will be the land, and the land will be you. If you fail, the land will perish. As you thrive, the land will blossom." Before the collapse of the kingdom, the land blossomed under Arthur's command. Now the collapse has happened, the kingdom is falling apart. Although the pathetic fallacy here is an exaggeration, it does highlight an important truth. This truth is that when people are happy and they are moral and are doing good work and building strong relationships, then it appears there is justice, peace, and prosperity in the world. Everything is in balance and the beauty of the world shines through. However, when a disaster strikes and people are unable or unwilling to be moral, to do good work, or to maintain their relationships, then the justice, peace, and prosperity that once prevailed now all fall apart. The balance is destroyed, and the beauty of the world turns into corruption. This works at a symbolic level and also at a practical level. If everything falls apart for enough people, and if everything falls apart for those of us who have the most power, then the nation itself will fall into chaos. Following the fall of the kingdom, Arthur calls his knights and says to them, "We must find what was lost, the Grail. Only the Grail can restore leaf and flower. Search the land, the labyrinths of the forest, to the edge of within. Only the Grail can redeem us." The knights then set off to find the Holy Grail. The Grail refers to a chalice filled with wine that Jesus shared with his apostles in the Last Supper. The Bible makes no mention of the cup except within the context of the Last Supper, and gives no significance whatsoever to the object itself. The Holy Grail was first implemented into the Arthurian canon by the French poet Robert de Biron in his late 12th century poem, Joseph de Arimathie, He asserts the Holy Grail was the chalice Jesus gave to his disciples in the Last Supper. Afterwards, Joseph of Arimathea let the blood of Christ pour into the chalice at his crucifixion. Joseph was then thrown into prison. Christ came to him and explained the mysteries of the blessed cup. Upon his release, Joseph gathered his in-laws and other followers and travelled to the west, where he founded the dynasty of Grail keepers that eventually included the Knight of the Round Table, Percival. The Grail is the chalice that houses the blood of Christ. It is manna from heaven. In Bormann's Excalibur, the search for the Grail begins because the kingdom has fallen apart. The only thing that can save it is for the king to drink the blood of Christ. The king must absorb a substance of absolute purity and holiness. It is only then he will be able to reconstitute himself so he can save the realm. We follow Percival as he embarks on his quest to find the Grail. He travels to the frozen wastelands of the north and through poverty and famine-stricken villages of the land. He searches for years and eventually finds a boy who is bedecked in golden armor and wears a cherubim mask. The boy takes him to a tree where other knights of the Round Table have been hung from the branches. He says to Percival, they were looking for it too. They then go to a castle where Morgana is waiting. She reveals the child is Arthur's son Mordred, and she says to Percival, you have crossed the great wasteland. You are burning with thirst. Drink. She offers him a golden cup brimming with fine wine. She says, for 10 years and a day you have searched. Tell me, have you found what you seek? I have found nothing but sorrow and death. He sees the other knights of the Round Table are in her service and asks her again if she has the Grail. She says, there is no Grail, as these good knights have found. They serve me instead. There are many pleasures in the world, many cups to drink from, and they shall be yours. Drink. He refuses her, and so he is taken by the knights. They string him up on the tree beside the other knights, who also decline to join her service, and he is left to hang. As Percival's life slips away from him, he dreams he crosses a drawbridge into a castle. Inside, there is a massive Grail that pours out Christ's blood. A booming voice asks, what is the secret of the Grail? Who does it serve? Percival escapes out of the castle and wakes from his dream. As the spurs of a dead knight who is hanging from the tree above him cuts the rope around his neck, he falls and lands on the ground before the tree. He hurries away and eventually ends up in a village. The village has been torn apart by hunger and disease. Its people are wallowing in despair. Lancelot appears amongst the villagers. He is bedraggled and shouts at Percival, look at the great knight. Peace and plenty they promised. But what did they give us instead? Famine and pestilence and death. Because of their pride and because of their sin, God has left the world. They made themselves God, and Christ has abandoned us. Lancelot and the other villagers drive Percival off. He gets away from them by running through a river downstream. He tumbles down into the water which carries him along. He is submerged, and all of his armor is loosened and slips off him. Nearly naked, he surfaces and pulls himself up onto a bank. He turns around and sees a lowered drawbridge that leads into a castle. He crosses it, and inside the castle, there is a giant Grail that pours out the blood of Christ. Again, he is asked, what is the secret of the Grail? Who does it serve? He replies, you, my lord. Who am I? You are my lord and king. You are Arthur. Have you found the secret that I have lost? Yes, you and the land are one. Percival then returns to Arthur with the real Grail. Arthur drinks from it, and his soul is filled. In this part of the story, Percival sets off on an epic quest to find the Grail, so he can find a substance of absolute purity and holiness and give it to Arthur. Arthur will then be reborn and he will be able to save the land. Percival searches for 10 years. He travels through barren terrain and he finds nothing, only despair. Eventually, he meets Mordred, who is dressed as a cherubim. Mordred takes Percival to Morgana. She wears a finely woven and lustrous gown, and she offers him a fake grail. In this scene, Percival faces temptation. He is searching for the chalice that houses the blood of Christ. Instead, he is offered a counterfeit substance by those who are finely dressed and whose words on the surface are seemingly nice, but below the surface, we see their words and intentions are pure evil. Percival admits to her he has lost hope. He is hungry and thirsty. He sees the other knights who have sided with her, and she says, "There is no grail, as these good knights have found. They serve me instead." So she denies there is a grail. She claims there is no substance of purity and holiness that can save the kingdom. Thus, his quest is pointless. The realm cannot be saved. She then says, "There are many pleasures in the world, many cups to drink from, and they shall be yours." This is a massively fraudulent statement. The purpose of his quest was not to find pleasure, it was to find the Grail so he could save the kingdom. And her assertion that there are many cups to drink from, and they shall be yours, implies there is no one Grail. Instead, there are many cups that brim with purity and holiness. She asserts that purity and holiness are easily obtained, and they're the same thing as pleasure. She is stating there are no underlying truths to the world. There is no code of honor. There is no morality that we must strive to embody. All of these virtues are easily obtained because everything is about pleasure and instant gratification. Don't try to save the realm. Don't try to make scientific progress. Don't try to create art that pleases the gods. Don't try to improve yourself. Just think about pleasure. Just think about instant gratification. She is offering Percival a fake grail. It is the substance that leads directly to hedonism, to self-destruction, and to hell. And unfortunately, many of the other knights have drunk from this fake grail. They have bought Morgana's lies and are now in her service. Percival, however, is able to resist temptation, and so he ends up being hanged on a tree where the other knights who were searching for the Grail and who also resisted Morgana's temptation were sent to die. An important point is made here. It's unfortunate that one of the major consequences of being courageous and standing up to evil is that you will be attacked. People who are evil, who sell snake oil, dressed up as the water of life, do not like it when there are those who are honest and courageous and who stand up to them, and they will try to destroy these people. The knights hanging from the tree are those who were courageous and good, and they died because they stood up to Morgana. So why is it that Percival is able to find the Grail while the other good knights failed in this mission? Part of the reason, I think, is luck. On a mission of this difficulty, even among those who are courageous and whose hearts and intentions are pure, there will be casualties, and there are. But there are also those who find what they seek. Another reason is destiny. Percival is the one who is destined to find the Grail. He has positive attributes and qualities the other knights do not have. It is written into the stars that he will find it, and they will not. The final reason is momentum. It may be that 100 people stand up to an evil, authoritarian dictator, and they are killed for doing so. However, the people see that many others are standing up to this dictator, and thus the fight against them gathers momentum. We see this notion of momentum symbolized in the dead knight who is hanging from the tree. His spurs cut the rope that Percival is hanging from. There are many who have stood up to Morgana. Their courageous actions have generated enough momentum so that Percival is able to escape being hung, and he goes on to find the Grail. As I explained, the first Grail that Percival finds is the fake one Morgana offers him. The second Grail he sees when he is hanging from the tree is not a fake Grail. It is a dream, a glimpse of the real thing. If any of us are trying to improve ourselves, or we are trying to make a new scientific breakthrough, or we are trying to save our country, usually this isn't something that happens overnight with minimal exertion on our part. Instead, we work diligently towards our objective. We dream that we will achieve our goal, and eventually we do. Percival has rejected the fake Grail, and he has proceeded in his quest with honor and goodness, and so he is able to glimpse what the real Grail looks like. After he falls from the tree, he then proceeds through the land. At the village, he faces the people whose lives have been ruined by pestilence and famine. He is forced out of the village and escapes by heading down a river. The river carries him along, and he is submerged. All of his armor is loosened and slips off him, and he is left near naked, without his knight accoutrements. Here we see that he is only able to find the Grail once he has been reborn. This is the universal truth. In all of our great quests, we are only able to achieve our objective once we have been reborn. As a result of the athlete's training, his body shape changes, and he is then able to go on and win the great race. As a result of all of his years of study, the way the scholar's brain works is permanently changed before he goes on to achieve success in his field of study. In all of our quests to do something great, if we work hard and we are able to achieve the sought-after goal, the journey changes us. We become a different person to the one who started out on the quest. We are reborn. The Grail asks Percival, "What is the secret of the Grail? Who does it serve?" Percival replies, "You, my lord. You are my lord and king. You are Arthur." The Grail asks him, "Have you found the secret that I have lost?" "Yes, you and the land are one." Percival then returns to Arthur with the real Grail, and Arthur drinks from it. The secret of the Grail is that Arthur is God's chosen emissary on earth. His duty is to rule the nation as God's servant. If he rules well, the land will prosper and bloom. If he rules poorly, the land will wither and die. The chaos in Arthur's soul has brought devastation to the land, and Arthur is broken. But he is reminded of his mission to do God's duty. He drinks from the Grail, and his soul is filled. The next sequence is one of the great moments in cinema. Arthur and his knights ride out from Camelot. In the background, the classical music piece O Fortuna plays. This was originally a medieval Latin poem written early in the 13th century, part of a larger piece called Carmina Burana. In 1935 to 36, it was set to music by German composer Karl Orff. The lyrics to this song are about the malevolent force of fate and how it strikes down well-being and health in both men and gods. In the music, there is a storm of urgency and power that creates this feeling of a deadly reckoning. It's this emotion that John Borman taps into in this scene, as Arthur and his knights ride forth from the castle into the barren land. We see flowers push forth from the ground. They ripen and bloom. The knights continue onwards. The sun breaks from the clouds. Trees ripen. The grass grows. Colours burst. They ride through an orchard of apple trees. Their white flowers bloom and fall from the branches. First a steady rain, then a storm. There's life everywhere. This moment is euphoric. King Arthur has replenished his soul. His purpose in life has become clear to him again, and he and his knights ride out with absolute purpose. They will defeat Morgana and her satanic son Mordred. They will fight for the future of their kingdom, the future of their culture, and so that stories will be told about them and their names will echo down through the ages. They have chosen to accept their burden as those who fight for good, as those who will stand up to evil and who will destroy it. And in that moment, everything in their life is infused with beauty and meaning. The land itself heals as they ride across it, and life blooms. Everything they touch bursts with vitality. Then with the storm of white flowers, there is an overabundance of meaning and beauty. It is everywhere. It is overwhelming. The knights ride on. Arthur meets Guinevere at a monastery. She has become a nun. She reveals she has kept Excalibur and she gives it to him. Arthur and his forces then ride on to Camlan, where they will fight against Mordred's army in the final battle between good and evil. They arrive in the evening, and Arthur goes to a nearby stone circle. He asks for Merlin's help. Merlin appears before him in a dream and agrees to help him in the battle ahead. Merlin travels to Mordred's camp. He goes to Morgana and challenges her that she has forgotten the charm of making. He asserts, "I once released the dragon's breath so Uther could lie with your mother and beget a king. It almost destroyed me, but I expect you could do it quite easily, couldn't you? I see no mist. Have your powers faded too? The charm, that's it. Use the charm." Morgana's pride takes hold. If Merlin was able to release the dragon's breath, then she can do it too. She uses the charm to create a fog that spreads through the camp. Mordred is perplexed. Why is there a fog rising? This won't help them in the battle ahead. He goes to Morgana's tent. Prior to releasing the fog, she had used up most of her power, ensuring that she remained young and beautiful. Having used the charm of making to release the fog, she has used up all of her power. Now it is all gone, and she appears before Mordred as her true self. She is an old hag. Mordred stares at her, aghast. As she moves towards him, he attacks her and kills her. Morgana uses the power of the dragon to serve herself, to cause devastation, and to create a monster who she believes will bring her absolute power. When she is bereft of her magic, her true form is revealed. The monster she has created sees her as an old hag, and he kills her. The price she pays for the evil she has wrought in her life is that this evil turns on her and it consumes her. At dawn, a fog covers Mordred's camp and Arthur's forces attack. A brutal battle then ensues. Arthur's forces fight well, but they are overwhelmed by the greater numbers of those who fight for Mordred. It is at this point, when it seems everything is lost, that Lancelot enters the fray. Fighting for Arthur, he cuts through Mordred's forces and turns the tide of the battle. Lancelot defeats the last of Mordred's knights, and he then falls to the ground, clutching a wound in his side. Arthur finds him, and as Lancelot dies in Arthur's arms, he says, "My salvation is to die a knight of the Round Table." To summarize the final battle, it represents the eternal fight between good and evil. Those on Arthur's side are faithful to the realm and its true king. They have not been corrupted by Morgana's riches, magic, or power. On the other side are the forces of evil. They are the ones who have been corrupted by Morgana. They have chosen to fight for the side of evil. The battle itself is brutal. It's the final battle of a civil war. The knights who helped forge the kingdom, who once gathered as brothers at the Round Table, they now fight against each other and they slaughter one another. When Lancelot arrives, he turns the tide of the battle. This is immensely significant. He is the realm's greatest knight. It was his affair with Guinevere that caused the kingdom to fall. But he now returns at his king's hour of need. And in the great battle between good and evil, he helps defeat the side of evil. As he dies in Arthur's arms, he says, "My salvation is to die a knight of the Round Table." Here we see that when he died, the day his life was judged, he fought for his king, his country, and for the side of good. Only 3 knights remain alive at this point, King Arthur and Percival, and they face off against Mordred. Mordred and Arthur walk towards each other. Mordred impales Arthur with a spear, who in turn impales Mordred with Excalibur. Mordred dies and Arthur falls to the ground, having been mortally wounded. He asks Percival to find a clear, calm pool of water and to throw Excalibur in. Percival takes the sword to a nearby lake, but is unable to throw the sword away. He returns to Arthur and says, "My king, I couldn't do it. Excalibur cannot be lost. Other men." Arthur replies, "Do as I command. One day a king will come, and the sword will rise again." Percival returns to the lake and throws Excalibur towards its center. The lady of the lake raises her hands from the water. She catches the sword and pulls it down into the lake. Percival returns to the site of the battle. Arthur has now died. His body is on a small boat. 3 sirens stand over him, and the boat sails away from the shores of Britain towards the Isle of Avalon. The story ends here. The fight between Arthur and Mordred represents, again, the eternal battle between good and evil and the forces that exist beneath them, order and chaos. The fact that the 2 men impale each other with their blades and they both die demonstrates that in this eternal battle, the 2 sides will always defeat each other. Goodness is the path that helps forge order from chaos. It is the path of honor, courage, and truth. Evil is the path that destroys order and leads to chaos. It is the path that destroys friendships and relationships. It ruins lives. It leads to the fall of kingdoms and the opening of the hellmouth. Good will always overcome evil and vice versa. Similarly, order will always defeat chaos and vice versa. There is an eternal balance that exists between good and evil and between order and chaos. One cannot exist without the other, and one cannot triumph wholly over the other. These forces are fated to battle against each other until the end of time. As he lays on the ground dying, Arthur asks Percival to throw Excalibur into the middle of a lake. Initially, Percival cannot do this because he wants to keep the sword so that the new king can wield it. Arthur tells him no, he must throw the sword away. One day a king will come and the sword will rise again. At one level, the message here is that the sword of power is not for men to keep and give to each other. It represents the power of God, and it is God who will decide who wields Excalibur. Thus, it must be returned to him. In Arthur's words, there is also hope for the future, that when the realm has fallen into evil and misery, a king will come and the sword will rise again. The Lord will give his blessing to a future king who will wield the sword of power. This king will use his power responsibly. He will unite the kingdom, and he will ensure for his time on earth that good triumphs over evil and that order triumphs over chaos. And this fight must be fought again and again throughout the ages until the day the kingdom eventually falls into chaos. This is the message at the heart of the story. The dragon of chaos forged the land, and eventually the dragon of chaos will devour it. So, in the battle between order and chaos, chaos will have the final victory. Percival then returns to the site of the battle, and he witnesses Arthur being carried off in a boat. Three sirens stand over him, and the boat sails onwards towards the shores of Avalon. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's History de Regum Britanniae, he asserts that Arthur, having been injured at the Battle of Canlan, was taken away to the Isle of Avalon so he could be healed and then one day return. This message is somewhat implied in Boorman's film. Maybe it will be Arthur who returns in the future so he can save the realm again. Or maybe he is being taken to the afterlife and it will be another king who rises in the future and who wields Excalibur. So that's the story, and it's glorious. I think it's an incredible primordial tale, a fusion of myths and archetypes. There's a vast amount of wisdom and knowledge in this story, and I think it gives us all a purpose. I believe we should all endeavour to take Excalibur, the sword of power, and to use it to do good, to ensure that our lives, our community, and the nation itself becomes a better place. We must use the sword of power to make sure that we leave the world a better place than when we entered it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ewan Jones.
Some questions now.
I wonder if I could kick off the questions. It's notable the way John Boorman put it together, that in almost every scene he described, there's a mythological parallel, whether it's from a Christian tradition or a pagan tradition. For example, when Percival is in the castle of Morgana, and Morgana tempts him, Percival, of course, is very pure and very, very holy. And that's a sort of direct parallel to Christ being tempted by Satan in the wilderness. And it's almost an identical language Morgana uses. Look at all this power you can have. If you know. Of course, Percival is pure, so he denies it. Then Percival is hung on the tree. And whilst he's hanging on the tree, he has an insight of the Grail. He can sort of perceive it for a moment, which is, of course, is a direct parallel to Odin hanging on the tree, Yggdrasil, knowledge. And it almost seems the way Boorman's put this together, in every scene there's the Arthurian story, and there's also a parallel from another mythological tradition. It's particularly striking how intense it is, and how it works as a piece of videography. I wonder, has there ever been any other film in Britain, really, that's even attempted to do anything, even attempted to do something so ambitious?
Not many. I can't really think of many films that have, actually taken on mythology at this level. I mean, the only one I can think of is actually, I believe it's a Swedish film, The Seventh Seal. And I watched that, and it was completely infused, like every image with mythology and that kind of logic. But I can't think of any from British film history. Obviously, I can't think of every single film right away, and probably something will come to me in a few hours. But I think it's absolutely fantastic. And if we compare it to a lot of the other King Arthur films, to me, they fall apart because, with some of them, there's some sort of obsession about being historically accurate. And it's like, that's not the point. The point is, it's about the mythology. It is about the images and the symbols and the meanings they convey. And that absolutely is, what this film by John Boorman, it just goes into such depth in terms of the mythology. And I just think it's a stunning piece of work because of that.
So a lot of mythology and archetypes can be used in a sort of post hoc fashion to dissect what's occurred and relate to it in a very linear way. But do you think there's anything of predictive value for like future events, in the modern world that we can learn from these sorts of allegories specifically?
Like in specifically within the King Arthur story?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, all of it basically, and I think it within the Grail sequence, for instance, when Percival is tempted by this first Grail, the fake one. Yeah, you know, I see parallels with this scene to modern life and various forces. Some of them, you know, work for BBC News, presenting this morality and this truth, which when you gaze underneath the surface, it's absolutely abhorrent and it's not the truth, and what they're saying is not moral. And, you know, so I think this will always be with us, you know. I suppose cheap con merchants who are trying to sell you a substance that will make your life better, they tell you, and what you have to do is actually think, you know, will this make my life better? Will this actually lead me towards having a more moral existence? And generally, I'd say, you know, through the search for the Grail, that's basically the search that we all go through in all of our lives. And, you know, we are tempted with cheap counterfeit substances and cheap counterfeit life paths and, you know, cheap counterfeit morality. And, I mean, we might fall into that for a certain time, but I think that, you know, if that becomes your entire life, then it's a wasted life, and you don't achieve a lot, and you don't really contribute towards anything positive in the long run. Whereas if you do actually focus on the truth, if you do actually focus on purity and on actually trying to make your life better, and, you know, you just basically cut the bullshit, then I think by doing that you can have a far better life, and generally the world itself becomes a better place if enough people do that. So yeah, I think there's some just incredible themes that are powerfully, you know, wielded and shown within this story.
Can you explain a little bit more about the symbolism of the drinking of Christ's blood? Because obviously this is a theme which runs through many ancient religions, these kind of cannibalistic practices almost, or, you know, blood cults. But do you think that the movie would have worked in the same way if there wasn't this blood drinking?
So I think you could look at various cannibalistic cults in the past, and to be honest, I haven't really researched any of them. And I mean, I guess we are talking about a time in the world's development which was very different to the world we all live in now. And so for me, it's quite hard to start moralizing towards people who lived, say, in the 6th century AD or prior to that. I think there is this notion that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, which is this notion that in order to make things better, you need to make sacrifices, and if you make the ultimate sacrifice, then that will lead to, you know, the optimal gains for yourself in your life and for the whole of your community. And obviously, this is symbolized in the story of Jacob, when, you know, he eventually, when he's over 100 years old and he eventually gets a son, and God tells him to sacrifice his only son, and he's prepared to do it. And then God tells him, no, it's all right, you don't have to. And so I guess at a moral level, that shows this idea of sacrifice and, you know, people being willing to actually give up it all, to give up everything in the service of trying to do good. And I think that's shown in that particular story that I just said, and also in Jesus at his crucifixion, allowing himself to be killed, and also, I suppose, with God allowing his only son to be taken out of the world, to be murdered by the humans. And so it's this in that particular story, it's the idea of divinity sacrificing a part of itself to ensure the continued survival and prosperity of humans. And I think the blood of Christ represents that. And so when Percival drinks it and when Arthur drinks it, it's the process of absorbing this substance of absolute purity and holiness. And I think there's something that's immensely powerful in that. Firstly, there's kind of a link that's drawn between Arthur and between Percival, and between them and Jesus, and also God. And there's also their desire to do the work of God, to go forth and do absolute, and to be absolutely good people, to ride into battle against Mordred and to fight against him, and basically to do this fantastic work that needs to be done, and to be courageous in their lives. And I think there's this, both they and also divinity itself are sacrificing an element of themselves to ensure that the future is, basically that the world becomes a better place.
An earlier question from the floor asked whether there might be some predictive power in looking at Arthurian and other type folklore and myth. It's a very interesting question. I wonder whether we could see the betrayal of Arthur by Lancelot, because it's an interesting story coming in from the 12th century French Romance, where Lancelot appears and then Lancelot's with Guinevere. Now, in any normal situation, a man whose wife is, carrying on, even if it's with his best friend, I mean, the man would have to sort that out, and it wouldn't end well for Lancelot in any normal situation. But of course, Arthur is the king, so he has other responsibilities. So for a king, this Lancelot happens to be sort of a kingpin of the Round Table and a critical knight. So for the king, he isn't able to act like a normal man because his responsibilities for the realm. So where in normal circumstances he'd have to kill the man who's running around with his wife, here he can't, because his duty as a king is to keep the land together. And maybe there's a lesson in that, in that really Arthur's first duty is always to the land that he serves, and that even is more important than obviously his marriage. And John Boorman plays this very well in the film, because Arthur's tortured by Guinevere's betrayal, and even right at the end of the film, where John Boorman shows Arthur and Guinevere meeting for a last time. So maybe there's some predictive power in the duties of the king are above the personal duty.
Okay, yes, I agree with that. I think that it's for me the whole thing connotates the fragile peace that exists within the brotherhood of the Knights of the Round Table. That they're all going out and they're all doing well, and they're all progressing in their own lives, and they're trying to ensure that there is peace and prosperity in the land. And they've got quite a high charge on them, because if they're going out, and they're basically the medieval equivalent of police officers now, and they're trying to ensure that people around the realm are doing okay in their own lives, and that the borders of the nation are secure, and that everything is going well. And I mean, they're basically, they're actually heroes of the day. But the fact is that it's a very fragile piece that keeps everything together, and it just falls apart with this affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. And it's at that moment that the entire brotherhood falls apart, and Arthur's, his mental state falls apart, and everything in his life just tumbles downhill. And I find this a powerful idea, because it's true, basically, that in our own lives we do forge friendships and relationships with other people, but it is very much a fragile piece that exists, and it could fall apart at any moment. And obviously there's the contrast between Uther's story, where the pact he makes falls apart within about 20 minutes of him making it, when he starts screaming out that he needs to fuck Cornwall's wife, compared to Arthur's reign, and which continues for many years. And he brings peace and prosperity to the land and builds a beautiful castle, and it is this centre of art, of science, of commerce, and so everyone's life improves. But then eventually the same fate that befell Uther also befalls Arthur. So yeah, I mean, it's this problem of chaos, isn't it? That it's always at the gates, and it's always going to come rushing in.
On behalf of Oxford Men's Group, I'd like to extend our very warm thanks to Mr. Ewan Jones for his lighting and fascinating talk. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Cheers.